What if I told you that the moment that sent the entire royal variety performance spiraling into chaos didn't happen on stage, backstage, or even in the red carpet frenzy outside the theater? It happened in a single instant. One joke, one image, one perfectly timed flash on a giant LED screen that made two future monarchs burst into laughter while millions of viewers around the world froze in secondhand shock. And that image was a spinning loading icon. A simple, ridiculous buffering loop that somehow managed to do more damage to the Sussex brand than any interview, documentary, or tabloid headline this year. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. But before we dive into that moment, the exact second the host delivered the line that detonated the room, let me ask you something. Have you ever witnessed a crowd become one unified organism? Not hostile, not cruel, but undeniably ready. Ready to laugh, ready to react, ready for something they didn't even know they were waiting for? That's exactly what happened at the 2025 Royal Variety performance. And if you think the internet went wild when the clip leaked, wait until you hear what actually happened inside that auditorium. The conversations in the royal box, what Catherine whispered to William, and the message sent from Meghan's camp less than 30 seconds after the joke landed. Because the public only saw a fraction of the chaos. The real story is so much bigger, so much stranger, and so much more revealing than anyone outside that building could ever imagine. But let's start with the moment that pulled everyone in. The lights dimmed, the audience settled, and then, without warning, a giant spinning loading icon flashed across the giant theater screen behind the performers, filling the stage with that familiar, maddening swirl. The kind you see when your Wi-Fi dies at the worst possible time. The kind that makes you question whether your entire life is about to freeze with it. And the host, standing dead center in the spotlight, turned toward the screen and delivered the line that would ignite the royal box. Meghan's Hollywood comeback is still buffering. Please be patient. The progress bar is stuck at 2%, right next to her approval rating in Britain. The silence lasted half a second, maybe less. Then the theater exploded. People gasped. People choked on their drinks. People slapped the tables. And yes, Prince William nudged Catherine as they both leaned forward and laughed. Not a polite chuckle. Not a diplomatic, controlled smile. They laughed. Real laughter. Shoulder moving, eye crinkling, genuine amusement. The kind that says, finally, someone said what everyone else has been thinking. But here's the part the public didn't see. That laugh wasn't just a reaction. It was a release. A pressure valve snapping off after months of tension between the brothers, after endless headlines about Hollywood deals, after years of palace drama splashed across international media. That laugh, those 3 seconds, told more truth about the state of the royal family than any insider ever has. And the moment it happened, people noticed. Staff in the aisles, guests in the surrounding boxes, celebrities in the front row. Even cameramen, who weren't supposed to look away from the stage, instinctively turned their lenses toward the future king and queen, sensing the electricity of the moment. But before we dig deeper into that reaction, the body language, the timing, the meaning behind every micro-expression, let's rewind, because none of this happened by accident. And no one inside that theater walked in expecting the night of safe, traditional royal comedy. Not this year. Not with the host they selected. Not with the audience that filled those velvet seats. Not with the bubbling rumors circulating backstage hours before the performance began. What rumors? There were several, but one in particular had the crew whispering even before the opening musical number. Apparently, a certain comedian, known for his biting commentary and zero-filter humor, had pitched 3 different jokes about the Sussexes to the producers earlier that afternoon. And while the producers greenlit one, possibly 2, they absolutely did not approve the version the host ultimately delivered. He didn't just tweak the approved joke. He detonated it. Which raises the question, why? Why take a risk like that? Why throw a verbal grenade into the middle of a royal crowd during the most prestigious entertainment event of the year? Well, according to someone who was backstage during rehearsals, there was a feeling that this year needed something different. Something bold. Something honest. Because like it or not, the Royal Variety performance is not just a show. It's a barometer, a cultural pressure point, a moment where the nation's mood, frustrations, and desires spill into the spotlight in the form of jokes, performances, and awkward crowd reactions. So when the audience roared with laughter at the buffering joke, it wasn't just because it was funny. It was because the joke spoke to a growing sentiment that many people felt but rarely expressed publicly. An exhaustion with drama, a quiet frustration with Hollywood narratives, a longing for stability, tradition, even unity. And who better to represent that craving for stability than William and Catherine, sitting just a few rows from the stage, reacting naturally and openly to humor at the exact moment the nation needed a release. But don't mistake this for a simple moment of comedy, because there was something else in that laugh. Something deeper. Something a little more complicated. Because if you watched closely, you would have seen William lean slightly toward Catherine first, as if silently asking, "Are we allowed to laugh at this?" And Catherine's reaction said everything. She laughed before he did. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with a kind of elegant confidence that reassured everyone watching, especially William, that it was okay, that this joke wasn't about cruelty. It was about relief, about the absurdity of it all, about the fact that after everything the royal family had endured, interviews, tell-all memoirs, Netflix revelations, late-night monologues, maybe, just maybe, they were allowed a moment of humor. Now, if you're thinking Meghan didn't take kindly to this moment, let me tell you something that might surprise you. She saw the clip almost immediately. And not because someone sent it to her as a joke. Inside sources claim that her team's phones lit up the moment the joke aired. Not from fans, not from enemies, from industry people, Hollywood producers, PR advisors, people who understood exactly what the joke meant. Because in Hollywood, perception is currency. And a joke like that, landing in front of the royals, in a venue that traditionally avoids anything too controversial, carried meaning far beyond mere humor. And apparently that's when the first message was sent. A message backstage. A message to the show producers. A message to one particular royal aide. A message allegedly from Meghan's camp. And what it said, according to the whispers that started spreading backstage, was urgent, sharp, demanding, furious. But before we get to that message, let's return to the room. Not the stage. Not the audience. The royal box. Because while the camera caught a glimpse of William and Catherine laughing, it didn't catch the rest of reaction in the box. It didn't capture the subtle tension, the widening eyes, the stiffened shoulders, the family members who didn't laugh, the ones who looked away, the ones who pretended not to react. And it certainly didn't capture the moment a senior royal, someone very close to the center of the monarchy, turned their head sharply and whispered something to an aide seated behind them. An order, a warning, a request. We still don't know which. But the expression was unmistakable. The laugh was harmless, but the consequences were not. Because while the nation celebrated the joke online, while memes multiplied and hashtags trended and reaction videos racked up millions of views, inside the palace, this moment triggered a silent storm. A storm that would grow. A storm that would spread. A storm that would follow the family out of the theater, into their cars, and straight back to palace walls. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because the truth is, the buffering joke was only the beginning. The audience thought it was the punchline. William and Catherine thought it was the punchline. Even the host thought it might be the peak. But the real story, the real drama, it started the moment the laughter died down. Because just as the room was catching its breath, just as the applause softened, just as the host smiled in triumph, something happened off stage. Something that no one in the audience noticed. A phone lit up. An aide read a message. And in that moment, quiet, unseen, barely a flicker of movement, the night took a turn that would ripple through the entire royal family. Because that message wasn't from who they expected. And what it said would change the tone of the entire evening. What if the biggest laugh of the night, the moment that shook the royal variety performance to its core, wasn't actually the beginning of the drama at all? What if the real story started long before the host walked on stage? Long before the spinning loading icon flashed on the screen, long before William nudged Catherine with that unmistakable grin. What if the tension was already building the moment the royals stepped into the theater? Because here's the truth. The atmosphere inside the 2025 Royal Variety performance was not the welcoming, polished, glitzy environment that most viewers imagined. It was charged, almost electric, and not the good kind. It felt like the air before a thunderstorm, heavy, unpredictable, waiting for the first crack of lightning. Why? Because even though the show was supposed to be about entertainment, charity, celebration, and tradition, everyone in that room felt something else. Something under the surface. Something unspoken but impossible to miss. A question. A curiosity. A tension. Would someone mention Harry and Meghan tonight? Would the host dare? Would the royals react? Would the audience? It wasn't just a performance. The crowd knew that. It was a moment bubbling with anticipation. A night where the line between comedy and controversy was thinner than ever. And before a single joke was told, William and Catherine walked into that room carrying an entire year's worth of royal weight, media scrutiny, family strain, and unresolved drama behind them. Let's go inside the room. The velvet seats, the gleaming chandeliers, the soft hum of hundreds of whispered conversations, the camera crews adjusting their angles, the orchestra warming up, the stagehands rushing behind the curtains, the aides standing along the aisles pretending not to observe every reaction. Everyone was waiting, waiting for something to happen, waiting for someone to say the thing everyone was thinking, waiting to see how the future king and queen would respond. And even though William and Catherine carried themselves with grace, smiles warm, posture poised, hands lightly touching as they greeted guests, the truth was that they were walking into a room that felt like a test. They knew it. The audience knew it. Even the performers sensed it. Because earlier that day, a rumor had already begun circulating backstage. A rumor that the host had prepared a few sharper lines. Jokes that weren't in the official script. Lines that referenced recent royal drama. Lines that no one in the production team was brave enough to approve, but also too afraid to ban outright. Nobody knew which jokes, if any, would actually make the final cut. But everyone knew the odds. And everyone knew who the jokes would likely target. And as William and Catherine took their seats, they were not immune to the whispers drifting through the venue. Is he really going to do it tonight? Do you think he'll mention the Netflix stuff? What about the podcast? What about the Hollywood comeback? I heard there's a gag about the IG account. Everyone had heard something. No one knew the full version. That uncertainty was part of the tension. Now, let's talk about William and Catherine in this moment. Before the joke, before the laughter, before the clip went viral. They were calm, elegant, collected, but observant. William, especially, kept glancing around the venue with a subtle alertness, the kind you develop when you've spent years navigating public appearances that can turn unpredictable with the slightest shift in energy. Catherine, ever composed, leaned in to speak softly to him at least twice before the opening act began. The cameras didn't catch it, but those sitting behind them noticed. One guest whispered afterward that Catherine seemed to be reminding William of something, perhaps to stay poised, or maybe to prepare for a moment she suspected was coming. Why would she suspect it? Because Catherine, more than anyone, has mastered the unspoken art of reading a room. And this room was tight, focused, curious, even a little mischievous. It wasn't hostility. It wasn't negativity. It was something else. Something rarer. Expectation. Let's pause and really consider that. Have you ever walked into a space and felt that everyone was waiting for something? Not announced, not explained, not spoken aloud, but somehow universally understood? That's what this was. And the royals could feel it too. Now, here's where the story gets interesting. Even before the curtain rose, even before the orchestra played the opening note, even before the cameras rolled, something happened behind the scenes that set the tone for the entire evening. A small group of staff members, 3 producers and 2 assistants, gathered near the backstage entrance. They weren't adjusting lighting cues. They weren't rehearsing timing. They were arguing quietly about a single line in the host's intro script. One producer said it was safe. Another said it was dangerous. One insisted it wasn't appropriate for the royal variety stage. Another argued it reflected the cultural mood and would energize the audience. And the 5th person? The assistant who had seen the host rehearse earlier that afternoon? They simply said, "He's going to say it. We can't stop him." This wasn't exaggeration. This wasn't speculation. This was recognition. Acceptance. And that meant the most influential guests in the theater, the royal family, were also potential targets. Now, imagine knowing that. Imagine being William. Imagine being Catherine. Imagine sitting in that royal box, the whole world ready to examine your reactions under a microscope, knowing full well that a single camera shot of your smile, or your lack of one, could become international news in seconds. That was the tension before the laughter. Let's stay in that moment a bit longer. The lights dim further. The orchestra quiets. The audience hushes. The host walks onto the stage, smiling, relaxed, confident. But there is a subtle flicker of something else in his expression, something only those closest to the stage could detect. A kind of eager mischief. The look of someone who knows he's carrying a verbal grenade in his pocket. And that's when William sits up slightly straighter. Catherine's eyes follow the host with a bit more focus. An aide standing behind them shifts their stance ever so slightly. And then, the host begins speaking. Not the joke yet. Not the line that will break the internet. But the warm-up. The safe material. The expected remarks. The audience laughs politely, easing into the atmosphere. William and Catherine also smile, engaging naturally, glancing briefly at one another as if recalibrating their emotional footing. But even during those opening lines, something is off. Something is building. Something is about to give. And you can see it in the way the host paces the stage. Slow, intentional, like he's waiting for the perfect moment. Then something happens that most viewers watching from home never noticed. A stage manager, visible only to those sitting near the front, steps partially into the wings and signals frantically at someone offstage. Not a calm cue. Not a standard prompt. A warning. Because the next line in the host's hand wasn't the line they approved. And the stage manager knew it. But there was nothing they could do. The moment had already begun. The host inhaled slightly. The lights dimmed just a fraction. A small breath of anticipation rippled through the crowd. Catherine blinked slowly and leaned back just 1 inch, her instincts picking up the shift. William angled his head ever so slightly to the left, bracing, not visibly, but internally. And then, the stage screen behind the host suddenly flickered. A giant spinning loading icon flashed onto the stage. No sound effect, no build-up, just that symbol. That universally understood symbol of something that should be working, but isn't. And the audience froze, just long enough to sense that something was coming. And that's when the host turned, looked directly at the icon, and delivered the line that would echo across the internet. But we're not there yet. Because before that line leaves his mouth, before the room erupts, there is a single heartbeat of silence. A heartbeat filled with tension, curiosity, anticipation. A heartbeat where the entire room, whether they knew it or not, was waiting for permission to laugh, to react, to release everything they'd been feeling for months. That heartbeat was everything. It was the moment before the moment. And in that tiny gap of time, Catherine glanced at William. Just a flicker, just a shared glance. As if both of them sensed that something irreversible was about to happen. And they were right. Because the joke that followed would not only send the room into hysteria, it would set off a chain reaction that would ripple through the royal family for days. A chain reaction that began in this chapter. The tension, the expectation, the silent, powerful, invisible pressure in the room. And if you think that pressure disappeared after the joke, after the laughter, after the viral clip, you're mistaken. If anything, that was only the spark. The explosion came later, and the royal family felt every bit of it. But first, we need to witness the moment the spark ignited. Because the buffering joke wasn't just a punchline. It was the match, and the host was ready to strike it. What if I told you the most brutal joke of the night wasn't the one crafted in advance, rehearsed, polished, and approved by producers, but the one delivered spontaneously, triggered by the perfect combination of timing, tension, and a single image projected behind the host? What if the moment that made William nudge Catherine and laugh wasn't actually in the script at all? Because that's exactly what happened. The first jab of the night, the famous Hollywood comeback is buffering burn, wasn't supposed to be there. Not in that form. Not with that timing. Not with that level of sting. Not with that audience. And absolutely not with the royals sitting just a few rows away. But that's what made it work. Let's return to the exact second it happened. The host turned slightly, giving the audience the perfect view of his profile. Shoulders relaxed, stance confident, smirk creeping in like he already knew what was coming. The screen behind him flickered again for dramatic effect, the spinning loading icon glowing large enough for even the back rows to see. Everyone in the theater recognized that iconic symbol immediately. The circle that never ends. The loop of eternal frustration. The digital purgatory that everyone has experienced 1,000 times. And yet, at this moment, it felt different. Targeted. Intentional. Loaded. The audience leaned in, sensing a shift in the energy. A joke was coming. And not just any joke. A joke with teeth. But not even they expected how sharp those teeth would be. Because the host didn't ease into it. He didn't soften the blow. He didn't buffer it with context or warmth. He went straight for the throat. He jabbed his thumb toward the enormous loading icon. Meghan's Hollywood comeback, he said, pausing just long enough for the audience to anticipate something risky, is still buffering. A ripple of gasps moved through the theater. A few scattered laughs. Some stunned silence. And then, he doubled down. Please be patient. The progress bar is stuck at 2%, right next to her approval rating in Britain. The room didn't just laugh. It erupted. Exploded. Detonated. The sound was instant, raw, chaotic, uncontrollable. The type of laughter that bursts out before people even consciously process the joke. The kind that makes you slap the person next to you. The kind that leaves a sting in the air. This wasn't a polite chuckle. This wasn't a diplomatic giggle. This was hundreds of people reacting simultaneously to something they didn't even realize they had been waiting to hear. It wasn't the content of the joke alone. It was the freedom the joke represented. For years, the public had watched the Sussex saga unfold through interviews, documentaries, memoir excerpts, paparazzi statements, social media leaks, podcast monologues, and carefully timed PR campaigns. It felt endless. It felt exhausting. It felt like walking into a movie franchise that already had 15 sequels and no one could find the original plot. So when the host delivered this jab, simple, sharp, perfectly timed, it wasn't just funny. It felt cathartic. And that's where William and Catherine come in. Because the camera didn't focus on them immediately. It took a few seconds. But those few seconds were enough for the crowd near the royal box to witness something unexpected. William laughed before he could stop himself. A real laugh. A reflex. A release. A tiny rebellion against the pressure of perfect royal composure. And Catherine? She laughed too. Not dramatically. Not excessively. But with a level of genuine amusement that said everything. It's funny because it's true. And it's funny because it's been a long time coming. Let's dig into that reaction. William isn't someone who usually reacts strongly in public spaces, especially when it comes to jokes involving family drama. His default mode is controlled, diplomatic, careful. But this time, he didn't hold back. His expression softened, his shoulders relaxed, and his hand moved instinctively toward Catherine as if sharing the moment made it even funnier. Catherine wasn't far behind. Her eyes narrowed just slightly in that way she does when something genuinely amuses her. Her lips curved into that unmistakable, graceful but real smile. Her posture shifted ever so slightly forward, as if the joke pulled her in instead of pushing her away. And then came the moment no one expected. William leaned toward her, not enough for the cameras to catch, but enough that people in the nearest rows noticed. Enough that a few guests whispered later that they saw him whisper something like, "Oh wow, here we go." But that wasn't the surprising part. What shocked the audience, especially those closest to the royals, was Catherine's response. Because she didn't just laugh. She didn't just smile. She placed her hand lightly on William's arm in a way that said, "It's okay. We're allowed to laugh at this. We're allowed to feel human tonight." That small gesture was more powerful than any headline. It hinted at unity, at confidence, at a shared understanding between them. And more importantly, it hinted at how deeply they had both felt the weight of the past few years. But as the room continued laughing, something else happened, something subtle, but critical. The host noticed William and Catherine's reaction, and he capitalized on it. Comedians live for this kind of moment. It's fuel, encouragement, permission. When the future king and queen of England laugh at your joke, especially a risky one, you suddenly have the freedom to push the boundary even further. And the host felt that freedom surge through him like electricity. His posture straightened. His confidence grew. His grin widened. And the audience felt the shift instantly. If that first jab was the appetizer, the room knew, instinctively, that the main course was still coming. Now let's move behind the scenes for a moment. Because backstage, while the audience roared and the host basked in the reaction, panic was already unfolding. A producer shoved his headset down around his neck. Another whispered, "He wasn't supposed to say it like that." One of the assistants covered her face with her hands. and someone from the royal liaison team stepped backward so quickly they nearly bumped into a sound technician. Because the buffering joke, innocent as it seemed, was the first real breach of the night. And everyone backstage knew what that meant. If the host started with this, then where would he go next? But the panic wasn't just internal. Something else was happening. Someone backstage received a notification. A message. Not from Meghan. Not from Harry. Not even from a PR representative. But from someone far more unexpected. We'll get to that message soon. For now, let's return to the moment in the theater, because while backstage tried to damage control the situation, the rest of the room was still reacting. People weren't just laughing, they were reacting with their entire bodies. A famous actor near the front row slapped the armrest twice. A singer gasped and covered her mouth, eyes wide. A comedian in the VIP section leaned forward as if studying the delivery. A political figure chuckled so hard he wiped tears from his eyes. And then, something even more surprising happened. A few audience members looked toward the royal box, not to see if William and Catherine were offended, but to see if they were enjoying themselves. And when they saw the couple laughing, it gave the entire room permission to laugh even harder. Because the royals weren't just present, they were participating. They weren't just symbols, they were humans reacting to humor in real time. That made the joke hit harder. That made the moment more iconic. That made the video go viral. But here's something almost no one realized. The buffering joke wasn't only aimed at Meghan's Hollywood ambitions. It carried an undertone, a message, a commentary. Because the progress bar metaphor wasn't just about career stagnation, it was about public perception, approval ratings, reputation repair, rebranding cycles, the difference between a comeback story and a stalled one. And when the host delivered it, he tapped into a cultural sentiment that had been quietly growing for months. People were tired. Tired of drama. Tired of scandals. Tired of public feuds. Tired of theatrical narratives. This joke, intentionally or not, captured that exhaustion in the simplest possible way, a spinning icon. A symbol of waiting, of frustration, of wanting something to work and realizing it never will. Now, here's where the story sharpens even more. As the audience continued laughing, as William and Catherine settled back into their seats, the host turned, just slightly, and looked directly at the royal box. A knowing look, a bold look, a look that seemed to say, if you're laughing, then I can keep going. It was permission, and the entire room felt the shift. Have you ever seen a performer realize they've crossed the invisible barrier between entertaining and impacting? That was this moment. When the host saw the reaction from the royal box, something ignited in him. The energy changed. The tone changed. The pace changed. And the rest of the night would never be the same. Because this was only the first jab, the first blow, the first spark, the first tilt of the domino. And as powerful as it was, the next joke would be even sharper, even more unexpected, even more dangerous. Because the host was just getting warmed up. And the next line? The one he was preparing as the audience caught its breath? That one would make William cover his mouth. And Catherine leaned forward with disbelief. And someone in the royal box stiffened. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What if I told you the most revealing moment of the night didn't happen on stage, didn't involve the host, and didn't even include William and Catherine? What if the moment that truly exposed how the public felt about Harry and Meghan came from the audience itself? Raw, unfiltered, unrestrained? Because laughter tells the truth. And on that night, inside that historic theater, hundreds of people told the truth at the exact same time. Let's go back to the second after the buffering joke detonated. The sound in the room didn't rise gradually. It hit instantly, like a tidal wave crashing down all at once. One moment, the theater was tense, expectant, uncertain. The next moment, it was roaring, shaking, reverberating with a kind of collective energy no one, not the host, not the producers, not the royals, was prepared for. It was a laugh that didn't need explanation, a laugh that didn't need courage, a laugh that needed only a spark. And that spark had just been thrown. But the shocking part wasn't the volume. It wasn't the speed. It wasn't even the boldness. It was the unity. People from wildly different backgrounds, political stances, social circles, and industries all reacted the same way. Celebrities, politicians, business leaders, royal watchers, theater performers, foreign guests, socialites, even a handful of ambassadors. Every section of the hall reacted together. Why? Because deep down, everyone knew the joke wasn't invented out of thin air. It was born from months, years, of building frustration, fatigue, and emotional overload surrounding the Sussex narrative. This wasn't a punchline. It was a pressure valve snapping open. Let's zoom in on the audience. Front row. A well-known actor slapped his thigh so hard the sound echoed over the orchestra pit. His wife leaned into him, covering her mouth, trying not to choke on the champagne she had just sipped. Second row. A singer whispered, "Oh my God, he didn't," while her eyes sparkled with the kind of delight that comes only from hearing something outrageous in a setting where outrageous things are never said. VIP box. A political commentator leaned forward, laughing under his breath, then quickly tried to compose himself when he noticed cameras panning in his direction. And scattered throughout the hall were hundreds of smaller, more subtle reactions. People pressing their hands over their hearts in amused disbelief. People turning to their friends with wide eyes. People shaking their heads with that look that says, "I knew something big would happen tonight." But something else happened in those few seconds. Something social. Something psychological. Something telling. The laughter spread like a wave, but it wasn't chaotic. It followed a pattern. It began near the host, rippled through the front rows, moved up the aisles, climbed the mezzanine, and then exploded in the upper balcony. And with every second, it grew stronger. Why? Because humans don't only laugh because something is funny. They laugh because someone else has given them permission to. That permission came from William and Catherine. When people saw the future king and queen laugh first, really laugh, it did something powerful. It validated the feeling in the room. It removed the fear. It dissolved hesitation. It made the joke communal. But here's where it gets fascinating. The laughter didn't stay lighthearted. It shifted, deepened, evolved. It turned into something closer to release. A release from months of hearing the words Sussex, Hollywood deal, tell-all, victim narrative, family rift, exclusive interview, over and over and over until the public felt worn down. It turned into a release from watching the royal family get pulled into drama again and again, unable to respond publicly. It turned into a release from the heaviness that had shrouded royal coverage for too long. And for once, just once, the audience was allowed to laugh. Now, you might be wondering, did anyone look uncomfortable? Yes, a few did. A handful of guests in the more formal royal circle stiffened. Some pressed their lips into a line. Some tilted their heads just slightly, as if assessing whether the joke crossed the invisible boundary between humor and cruelty. But those reactions were in the minority. The overwhelming majority of the audience was not just amused, they were delighted, surprised, energized, and more importantly, united. And that was the shocking part. Because when a crowd laughs together, it reveals something deeper than amusement. It reveals alignment, agreement, a cultural consensus. And on this night, that consensus was unmistakable. The Sussex narrative had exhausted the public. Still, the reaction wasn't merely emotional. There was psychology behind it too. Think about it. When an audience is forbidden from laughing at something, socially or politically, they hold the tension inside. When they finally get permission, the reaction is explosive. This was years of pent-up reaction, years of restraint, years of avoiding saying the wrong thing. And that's why the joke didn't just land. It landed with impact. Now let's move to a different part of the theater, the rows behind the royal box. Because something interesting happened there too. Several attendees had been quietly discussing Meghan and Harry even before the show began, whispering about their latest documentary rumors, Instagram stories, interviews, and public statements. Nothing openly harsh, just the usual speculative chatter. But once the joke landed, those whispers transformed into a different kind of conversation. They weren't mocking. They weren't cruel. They were validating. I'm glad someone said it. I mean, honestly, it's been exhausting. That was brave of him. It's satire. It's allowed. And they laughed. That says everything. These weren't people rooting for drama. These were people relieved to finally see humor stitched back into a topic that had grown too heavy. And then, something crucial happened. Cameras turned toward the royal box. Not immediately, not aggressively, but enough that people near the back rows could see staff quietly signaling where to aim next. Why did they do that? Because the audience reaction was only half of the story. The real story, the one that would headline newspapers and trending hashtags, was how William and Catherine reacted. And audiences at home needed to see their faces. The cameras captured them. William, still leaning toward Catherine. Catherine, still smiling. Both relaxed. Both amused. Both unbothered. And that single shot served as confirmation for millions watching later. This wasn't just the audience laughing. The future monarchs themselves found it funny. And that meant something. But while the public saw unity, backstage saw danger. Because the louder the laughter became, the more urgently whispers started flying behind the curtains. Producers panicked. Assistants paced. A royal aide stepped out of the wings, pale and tense. Another began texting furiously. Someone else grabbed a printed program and began flipping rapidly through notes, as if searching for a contingency plan. They weren't afraid of the joke itself. They were afraid of what might come next. Because if the host was willing to start the night with that level of directness, it meant something bigger. He wasn't afraid to escalate. And escalation, in front of the royals, in front of celebrities, in front of global cameras, could spiral fast. Meanwhile, the audience continued laughing. Some leaned across the aisle to comment to neighbors. Some clapped between laughs. Some wiped tears. Even the orchestra members smirked. And the host? He stood in the spotlight, soaking it in. Confident. Recharged. Ready. The laughter was his green light. And he accepted it fully. But here's where the story takes a twist most people never heard about. While the laughter filled the room, while William and Catherine composed themselves, while the host prepared his next line, something unexpected happened in the left section of the audience. A group of foreign dignitaries, guests from a country with very formal protocols, looked absolutely stunned. Not offended, not angry, just shocked. They exchanged baffled glances, as if silently asking, "Is this allowed here?" Because to them, this level of royal-focused humor was unimaginable. In their cultures, joking about royalty or major political figures publicly, especially in front of them, was unheard of, restricted, even taboo. Their confusion added another layer to the moment. This wasn't just comedy. It was cultural commentary. It was political theater. It was social release. And the more confused those dignitaries looked, the harder the surrounding guests laughed, creating a sharp contrast between cultures, one embracing satire, the other stunned by it. But as amusing as this contrast was, it set up something even more important, the awareness that the evening had crossed into global spectacle. And that spectacle was about to escalate. Because as the laughter softened, just enough to create room for the next joke, the host shifted his stance, took a small breath, and began preparing the setup for another line. A bigger one, a sharper one, a more dangerous one that would go viral not for its humor, but for its target. Because if the buffering joke shattered the tension in the theater, the next joke would do something far more explosive. It would poke at the very heart of the Sussex story, and it would force William to cover his mouth, and Catherine to lean forward, eyes widening, and a senior royal, one known for maintaining composure, to visibly stiffen. Because the next joke didn't just hit the audience. It hit the royal family itself. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What if I told you that the second joke of the night didn't just make the audience laugh? It made the entire theater freeze for a microsecond, the kind of silence that happens right before something shocking drops. What if I told you the joke that followed the buffering punchline wasn't just sharper, it was far more personal? Because while the first jab mocked Meghan's Hollywood comeback, the next one targeted something deeper. Their credibility, their storytelling, their decision to monetize their royal fallout, and most importantly, their future. Let's return to the exact moment the laughter from the buffering joke finally began to fade. The room was still humming, buzzing, vibrating with that thick, riotous aftershock of humor. People were fanning themselves. Some were wiping their eyes. Others were still giggling under their breath. The host stood perfectly still, letting the waves of laughter wash over him. It was the mark of an experienced comedian, someone who knows timing, knows pacing, knows how to let the room breathe before hitting them again. Then he did something subtle. He tilted his head, just slightly, like a cat hearing a faint sound. It was a motion that told the audience, and the royal family, he wasn't done. And instantly, the room tightened. Not physically, energetically, because everyone knew that the way he delivered the buffering joke meant he wasn't stopping there. He wasn't retreating. He wasn't scared. He wasn't trying to smooth the moment over. He was building towards something. The anticipation was so palpable that a few in the audience leaned forward unconsciously, as if afraid they might miss the setup. And then he started, not with a jab, not with a punch, but with a casual, almost conversational tone. "You know," he said, strolling slowly across the stage, "I really admire people who tell their stories. It takes courage, honesty, vulnerability." The audience chuckled lightly, already sensing a twist. The host continued, "And of course, in Hollywood, they say the three most important things in storytelling are authenticity, consistency." He paused dramatically. "And a massive Netflix production budget." A shock of laughter burst from a pocket of the audience, but others waited. They knew the real joke hadn't landed yet. The room sensed a wind-up. "And you know, I watched that documentary," he said, with exaggerated seriousness. "I really did. I sat through the interviews. The tears. The dramatic music. The drone shots of Montecito. All of it." He looked at the audience and widened his eyes just enough to make them laugh. "But after episode 3, I swear I heard my television whisper, 'Please make it stop.'" The audience erupted again, louder, sharper, more unrestrained than before. And then he delivered the punchline that would make William cover his mouth. "I mean, I kept waiting for something to happen. Some secret revelation. Some explosive truth. But after 6 episodes, I realized something tragic." He turned toward the royal box. Absolute silence. "You know your documentary is in trouble." When the most dramatic part is the chicken coop. The entire theater exploded. Not a laugh. Not a scream. A combined sound. Pure chaos. Some people clapped. Some people stomped their feet. Others doubled over, gasping for air. 2 older guests in the front row leaned into each other, laughing harder than they had in years. And William? William covered his mouth. Not in shock. Not in disapproval. But in an attempt to hide how hard he was laughing. His shoulders shook. His eyes squeezed shut. He leaned forward, elbows nearly touching his knees. Catherine. She was no better. She was laughing with her whole face. Eyes shining, lips pressed together, cheeks lifting, and she placed her hand gently on William's back as he bent forward slightly. It wasn't mockery. It wasn't cruelty. It was relief. You could feel it. Have you ever laughed so hard at something that you didn't even realize you were holding your breath until after the joke landed? That's what happened here. It was the laugh you let out when something finally cuts through months of tension. But here's the twist. While William and Catherine were laughing, someone else in the royal box absolutely wasn't. A senior royal, one who prided themselves on composure, went rigid. Their jaw tightened. Their hands folded neatly in their lap. Their gaze fixed on the host with a disapproving sharpness that only a trained eye would recognize. It wasn't outrage. It wasn't embarrassment. It was something more complex. Concern. Because for the first time, the host wasn't simply poking fun at Meghan's Hollywood endeavors. He was making a statement. A cultural statement. A public reflection. A commentary on something the entire world had been watching unfold. The Sussexes' documentary wasn't just controversial. It had become a symbol. A symbol of oversharing. A symbol of self-promotion. A symbol of a broken narrative that wasn't landing the way they intended. And the audience's reaction confirmed it. This wasn't a fringe opinion. This wasn't a hostile crowd. This wasn't bitter or cruel. It was collective fatigue wrapped in laughter. But before we get deeper into the symbolism, let's go behind the stage again. Because while the audience was roaring, backstage was on fire. A producer shouted into his headset. He wasn't supposed to mention the documentary. Another producer grabbed a clipboard and smacked it against her thigh, whisper shouting. He skipped the safe joke. He skipped it. He went straight for the chicken coop. The assistant who had warned them earlier simply muttered, "I told you. When he goes off script, he really goes off script." But it was the royal liaison staff who were the most tense. One aide had stepped completely out of the shadows and was now standing near the curtain, eyes locked on the royal box, one hand hovering over their phone. They were waiting. For what? A signal, a cue, a reaction, anything that might tell them if the joke crossed a line. But what they saw instead surprised them. William laughing, Catherine laughing, the audience exploding with joy, the host pacing confidently. It wasn't a scandal forming. It was a moment, a rare moment of public release, a moment where the royals weren't victims of the narrative. They were participants in the break from it. But then something happened that shifted everything again. The host paused, mid-laugh, mid-chaos. He stepped forward and lowered his voice. "And look, I get it," he said, shrugging. "If my family kicked me out of the palace, I'd probably make a documentary too." The theater went silent. Dead silent. It was as if someone had pressed mute on the world. Even the air felt frozen. Because this wasn't just a jab. This was a line crossing into territory that the audience wasn't sure was safe. A line that referenced the family rift. A line that referenced palace drama. A line that touched the one thing the royal family keeps sacred. Internal conflict. William's laughter softened instantly. Catherine's smile faded just a bit. The senior royal who had been stiff before now looked alarmed. And the producers backstage? Pure panic. One grabbed the host's emergency cut cue card, something they never thought they'd actually need, and held it in the air. Another whispered, "No, no, no, don't push deeper. Not that. Not now." The audience sat on the edge of their seats, not sure whether to laugh, gasp, or brace themselves. And then, just as tensions peaked, the host saved the moment. He grinned and added, "But my family wouldn't kick me out. They'd just change the locks and hope I wouldn't notice." The pressure broke. Laughter returned, softer this time, but still genuine. It was a masterful recovery, the kind only a seasoned entertainer could pull off. But make no mistake, the audience had felt the moment. The royals had felt the moment. Backstage had felt the moment. It was the closest the night had come, so far, to crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But here's where the story takes a sharper turn. Because while the audience laughed again, while William composed himself, while Catherine breathed out the tension, someone in the royal box leaned forward and whispered something to an aide sitting behind them. A short sentence. A quiet instruction. A directive. The aide's eyes widened. They nodded quickly. And then they slipped out of the royal box and made their way discreetly toward the back of the theater. Why? What message did they receive? What instruction did they carry? Who was it meant for? The host? The producers? Someone watching from home? The answer, when it comes, will change everything. Because the documentary joke wasn't just a moment of humor. It was the spark that ignited a private reaction. A reaction that would influence the rest of the night. And the next joke? The one coming next? That one left the room stunned. What if I told you that while the audience was roaring with laughter, while William was covering his mouth to hide how hard he was laughing, and while Catherine's eyes shimmered with amusement, backstage was an absolute, unfiltered crisis? What if the real drama of the night, the drama no cameras caught, no live stream aired, and no reporter managed to capture, wasn't happening in the royal box at all? It was happening behind the curtains. Because the moment the host made that documentary jab, everything backstage snapped. A producer whispered, "Oh no, 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 no," as she watched the live feed. An assistant froze with her headset half-raised. A sound technician stopped adjusting the levels. Two crew members glanced at each other with massive, silent eyes. And at the center of it all was him, the lead show producer. The man responsible for keeping the royal variety performance polished, elegant, dignified, and most importantly, safe. This man was not laughing. Not even close. He was pale, rigid, focused. He looked like someone who had just witnessed a chandelier fall from the ceiling, but was trying to pretend it didn't happen. Why? Because he understood something the audience didn't. The host wasn't just improvising. He was escalating. And if there's one thing producers fear more than anything during a high-profile televised event, it's escalation without warning. Remember, comedy is predictable. Improvisation is manageable. But escalation? Escalation can burn down the room. Let's walk through exactly what happened behind those curtains, the second the documentary joke landed. The producer slammed his headset back over his ears and said sharply, "Someone get him back on script. Now." A stage manager, standing just feet from him, blinked in shock. "Back on script? He's in the middle of a set." "I don't care. He's going too far," the producer said. "We approve the buffering joke. The light one. Not this." He gestured at the screen showing the live audience reaction. People doubled forward, gasping for breath, slapping the nearest armrest. And definitely not mentions of being kicked out of the family. Another producer, clutching a clipboard, chimed in. "He crossed the royal line. The liaison is going to kill us." And then everything got worse. Because while they were panicking, an aide, sent from the royal box, entered the backstage area. A royal aide, with an urgent expression and a direct message. Everyone went silent. The producer turned. The assistants froze. The lighting tech dropped his pen. The aide's voice was calm, but sharp enough to cut the air. We need to ensure things do not escalate further. Not please. Not could you. Not would it be possible. A clear directive. A royal directive. The producer swallowed. But he's gone off script, the producer said. We're trying to contain it. Then contain it, the aide repeated. This wasn't a suggestion. It was an order. But how do you stop a comedian mid-performance? How do you pull the reins without making the show look chaotic? How do you steer a moment that has already slipped out of your hands? That was the producer's dilemma. And the worst part? The host knew he was untouchable. He knew that the chaos was energizing the room. He knew that William and Catherine's laughter gave him audience immunity and royal immunity. As far as he was concerned, the room was his. And the moment he saw the royal box laughing, he wasn't going to hold back. Let's zoom out for a moment. This producer had spent the entire day making sure every minute of the show ran perfectly. Coordinating performers, managing lighting cues, timing the orchestra, prepping presenters, testing microphones, checking costume changes. And above all else, protecting the royal variety performance's tradition of balancing humor with respect. This wasn't the Oscars. This wasn't a Netflix comedy special. This was the royal variety, the crown jewel of British entertainment, where jokes are allowed, but lines must be respected, where satire is acceptable, but targeted personal attacks are discouraged, where royals are present, not as props, but as honored guests. And tonight, that balance was collapsing. Let's return backstage. The producer pressed 2 fingers against his temple, as if trying to stop a headache from exploding. Where is the host manager? He snapped. In the green room. Get him. And here's where the situation became even more chaotic. The host's manager wasn't concerned. He wasn't panicked. He wasn't nervous. He was thrilled. He walked backstage with the swagger of a man whose client was killing it on stage. He grinned at the monitors. That's gold, he said. Comedy gold. You're trending already, you know that? They're going to clip this everywhere. The producer stared at him. Trending, he hissed. This isn't TikTok. This is the royal variety. The royals are right there. I saw, the manager said, smiling. They laughed. That means we're good. The producer nearly combusted. That means we're lucky we haven't been shut down yet, he said. This show goes out once a year. One night. One chance. And he's turning it into a battlefield. But the manager shrugged. This is what you hired him for. No, it isn't, the producer said sharply. We hired him for wit, not war. And then the aide stepped in again. He needs to stay away from anything referencing the family's private matters, the aide said. If this continues, there will be consequences. The manager raised an eyebrow. For him or for you. It was subtle, soft, almost rhetorical, but the room felt it like a slap. Because the truth was, as controversial as the jokes were, the host was becoming the highlight of the night. He was overshadowing the performers. He was capturing the audience. He was electrifying the theater. And that put the producer in a terrible position. If he shut down the host too quickly, the audience would sense something was wrong. The royals would notice. The press would pick it up. And the entire night could collapse under the weight of awkwardness. But if he let it continue, well, anything could happen. And that was the problem. Too many eyes were watching. Too many cameras were rolling. Too many consequences were hovering just out of sight. Then something unexpected happened. A second message was delivered to the producer. Not from the aide, not from a royal, but from someone watching the broadcast remotely. Someone with influence. Someone whose identity the backstage staff refused to reveal later. This message was short, very short, but more powerful than anything the aide had said. It read, "He's about to go too far." That phrase alone sent the producer running. He sprinted, yes, sprinted, toward the curtain, signaling the stage manager frantically. "We need to interrupt him," he shouted. The stage manager stared at him. With what? It's a live comedy segment. The producer didn't blink. Find something. A prop. A technical cue. A lighting shift. Anything to break the momentum. Get the orchestra ready. Cue a transition. Something. Anything. But the stage manager's voice cracked. He's not listening to cues. And that was the moment the producer realized the truth. The host had complete control of the room. He didn't hear the cues. He didn't feel the panic. He didn't sense the danger. He only heard laughter. He only felt the energy. He only saw William and Catherine laughing. To him, that meant the show was working perfectly. And so, backstage descended into frantic whispers. Can we kill the screen? Can we dim the lights? Should we cut the mic feed? What about sending an announcer out? We can't do that. That's chaos. The orchestra conductor even stepped backstage for a moment, glancing nervously between the producer and the stage. Do you want us to interrupt him? He asked cautiously. The producer hesitated. Because any interruption would cause confusion. Any interruption would be noticeable. Any interruption would tell the audience something was wrong. And he couldn't risk that. Not with the royals watching. Not with cameras rolling. Not with millions waiting to analyze every second of this performance in the morning. So he made a decision. A risky one. A decision that would shape the entire rest of the night. Let him finish this next joke, he said. Then we intervene. A collective breath was held. Because letting him finish meant one thing. The next joke was coming. And the next joke was already on his lips. And the next joke would be even bigger, far more dangerous than any before it. The producer knew it. The aide knew it. The host's manager knew it. Even the stage crew, still frozen in place, knew it. Because the host was no longer following a script. He was following instinct, momentum, audience energy, and something almost no one realized. He was also reacting to someone in the royal box. Someone who didn't laugh. Someone who stiffened. Someone whose reaction emboldened him in a way no one expected. Because the host's gaze had shifted. His eyes locked onto someone offstage. Someone seated near the aisle. And the expression on that person's face told him everything he needed to know. He should keep going. And he would. The next line would be the most shocking one yet. But what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. What if I told you the most explosive part of the night didn't happen inside the theater, but on the phones of 3 people sitting thousands of miles away? What if the moment that sent shockwaves through the royal variety performance wasn't triggered by the host, or the audience, or even the royals, but by a single message sent in real time? Because while the host was on stage pushing boundaries, backstage was panicking, and the audience was losing its mind with laughter. Meghan's team was watching too, live, and they were not amused. Let's return to the second after the documentary joke landed. The exact moment when William covered his mouth to hide his laughter, Catherine leaned forward in disbelief, and the room buzzed like a beehive that had just been kicked. While the audience enjoyed the chaos, someone else was reacting in real time, half a world away. Meghan's PR team. And their reaction was instant. Phones lit up in Montecito. A laptop pinged in a Beverly Hills office. A crisis manager sat bolt upright in her chair. Within seconds, they clipped the moment directly from the live stream. Within seconds, they sent it to Meghan. Within seconds, the first message arrived backstage at the Royal Variety performance. And that message changed everything. Let's break it down. At the exact moment the host joked about the Sussex documentary being less dramatic than a chicken coop, Meghan's phone, wherever she was, received a notification. It wasn't from a friend. It wasn't from Harry. It wasn't from a staff member. It came from someone on her crisis PR team, a professional whose entire job revolves around monitoring media, strategizing responses, calculating optics, and analyzing public sentiment. The message, according to a source who later described it, was blunt.